Thank you very much, Tom, for this kind introduction. This is a real honor and a pleasure for me to be part of this celebration of Norm Borlaug's tremendous contributions, not only to the global food system, but to the well-being of people. I first met Norm in the mid-70s. That was a time when some very loud economists and social scientists were telling the world that the Green Revolution was not a good thing. So when I told Norm that I was an economist, he was not amused. However, it didn't take very long. We had a conversation of maybe 15, 20 minutes, and he accepted that I was probably one of the good guys rather than one of those armchair critics that he didn't have a lot of time for. And ever since that time, I have benefited from interacting with Norm on many different occasions. I have never worked for Norm. He has never told me any dirty jokes, but except for that, we got along really well. So Norm, as we heard this morning, thought it was very important to interact with policymakers, to make them understand the importance of the interaction between policy and research, so that, in fact, the results from the research could benefit people. However, when I joined Ciudad in 1969, there was a live conversation, discussion, argument among the 4 centers that existed at the time as to whether these centers should really have economists. There wasn't much talk about policy analysts. Fortunately, that has changed, and it is now clear that it's an interaction between economics and the biological sciences that's important to achieve the goals that we all want. I just want to show you this picture of Norm. We have seen a number of pictures of Norm this morning. I particularly like this one. I think it's almost like seeing him. Now, you don't have to take my word for the fact that policy is important. You can take the word of a very world-renowned plant breeder. I borrowed this slide from Hans Brown's presentation at Cornell recently, where Hans said, look, about 1/3 breeding, about 1/3 agronomy, about 1/3 policy. That's probably about the right mix. Now, I don't know if Hans has the evidence to back this up, but what I do know is that what he was saying was we need to work together across disciplinary boundaries, and I think that's the important thing. Whether it's 1/3 or 1/4 or whatever, that's less important. We need to work together. Now, before I go into what policies I think we really need, and I am going to look to the future rather than the past, let me just say a few words about the context within which these policies have to be implemented. And I'll do this very quickly because a lot has already been said about the context by Bob and by the speakers this morning. So what is it we want from the food and agricultural systems? What is it societies want? They want food security and good nutrition. They want efficient and sustainable resource use. They want reasonable incomes to farmers, whatever reasonable means. Reasonable prices to consumers. They want agriculture and the food system to meet non-food demands, biofuel, for example, cotton, etc. And we are looking for agriculture in low-income developing countries to drive the rest of the economic growth. Nothing more than that. That's all societies really want. Piece of cake, right? Well, what is it we want from agricultural research? We want more food, we want more non-food, and we want that produced per unit we want more produced per unit of land, water, labor, and capital. In other words, we want productivity increases. We want lower unit costs of production and marketing. I think that is the key issue. That is where the Green Revolution made the greatest impact. It lowered the cost of production of these major staples, certainly including rice, wheat, and maize. which generated an economic surplus that could be captured either by the producer or the consumer, or in some cases the traders. And in fact, what the Green Revolution did, it made both the producer and the consumer better off, because that economic surplus was divided, more was produced at lower total costs. We want adaptation to climate change. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have some mitigation as well of the effect? We certainly want adaptation to climate change. We want agricultural research to reduce poverty and malnutrition. We want agricultural research to respond to the diet transition. I'll come back and talk about that in a minute. And then we want agricultural research to help stabilize production and food and agricultural prices. Let me go back and just say a couple of words about what Bob and others have said about population growth. This shows the average annual population growth in percent between 1950 and 2000, that's the red one. Between 2000 and 2050, that's where we currently are, that's the green one. And the yellow one is 2050 to 2100. Look at the small size of the 2050 to 2100, and remember that that's an average over 50 years. That means sometime before we reach 2100, we will have a negative population growth rate, if you believe in these projections. These are UN projections, the same as Bob used. So I agree with Bob that the key issue is probably not that rapid population growth is going to make it very difficult to meet the future food demand. I don't think that's the key issue. I think this is much more likely to be the key issue, and that is a diet transition that occurs when households move from low to middle income. They want to change their diet. They want to consume more of the higher-priced commodities. They certainly want to consume more bread, and therefore the demand for wheat is likely to continue to go up at a fairly rapid rate. They want more food of livestock of animal origin, and that means that the demand not only for the food of animal origin, but also for the feed, and that means maize and soybeans, that those commodities are going to be in greater demand as well. Look at this number. More than half of the middle class people in the world will be in Asia by 2020. Look at the increase from 28% in 2009 to 54%, and by 2030, 2/3 of the middle class will be in Asia. That's where the purchasing power is going to be. That is where the diet transition is going to put a lot of pressure on the food system. This is not to argue that we shouldn't focus on Africa. It's just to argue that that is where the major action is going to be in terms of changing the diet from the basic staples to the more expensive ingredients. We have already talked about malnutrition. There are basically three kinds of malnutrition. I call them the triple burden of malnutrition. There's lack of dietary energy, and the number 800 million has been kicked around. Nobody knows what the number is, but it's probably 800 million is a nice round number, so why not? Could be 500 million, it could be a billion, we really do not know. Then secondly, you have many more people suffering from nutrient deficiency. This is different from merely eating calories. They simply do not get the nutrients that they need, and the number that's being kicked around is 2 billion. But we really don't know. And then we have as the third burden the overweight and obesity, which is causing chronic diseases, diabetes, and heart diseases, etc., etc. And the number kicked around there is 1.5 billion people who are actually either overweight or obese. That is a nutrition problem. So let me now turn to policies. In most countries, but let me preface that, by the way, by saying that we should not I should certainly not stand here in Ciudad, Obregon and dictate policies for developing countries. Policies are context specific. They have to be decided in each context on the basis of a good understanding of that context. So all I can do today is to talk about those policies that I think are likely to be the most relevant for the largest number of low-income countries. And in fact, what I'm going to propose may not all be relevant for any one country. It has to be decided at the local and national level. I would argue that for most developing countries, certainly most of the low-income developing countries, we still have to focus on the smallholder farm family. This has been mentioned earlier today. Now, I say still because maybe 50 years from now it will be different. Maybe by that time the urban employment situation is such that many more people can be absorbed from the rural areas, because we will, of course, have rural to urban migration. The question is, how fast is it going to be, and can those who migrate, in fact, find employment and income generation in urban areas? Therefore, for the time being, and at least many years into the future, we need to focus on the smallholder farmer. But remember that agriculture is a private sector. So when we say, and I have said this many times, it's too bad that governments won't put more money into agriculture. What we should really be saying, it seems to me, is it's too bad that government won't help farmers invest in their own farms by removing these adverse environments within which these farmers work. I have never been in a straitjacket, and I hope none of you have either. But I can imagine that if you're in a straitjacket, you don't make a lot of movement. I think that's probably roughly the way it feels, although fortunately I don't know. I'm arguing that many of these smallholder farm families are in a straitjacket. They cannot get access to inputs at reasonable prices. They can't sell their output at reasonable prices. They can't get credit. They probably can't get access to improved seed, etc., etc., etc. That's where policy should be focused, in my opinion. So we need to talk about rural infrastructure to help farmers benefit from the outcome or the output of agricultural research. Because how would a smallholder farmer benefit from better technology if the markets don't work, if she can't get access to the inputs she needs, if she can't sell the output? And I'm going to come back and show some pictures of what can happen in such situations. So I would say priority number one in research supporting policies is investment in rural infrastructure. That means improved domestic markets, improved human resources. I have some specifics. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in each one because Tom is looking at me already. Feeder roads. We need much more investment in most, but not all, developing countries in feeder roads. Appropriate institutions. We need to help farmers form their own associations. No, we don't need to have a top-down association for farmers. They don't work. Neither do cooperatives that governments establish. We need to instigate the movement that will make farmers develop these kinds of associations. We need public sector institutions that many of us take for granted. Contract enforcement, for example. Of course you enforce a contract. No, not necessarily. It depends on whether the institutions are in place to do so. What about weights and measures, etc.? There are a number of these institutions that many of us take for granted that need to be in place. We need market information, access to inputs, for example, seed and fertilizers. need water management institutions. Some of that has to be paid for by the public, some of it has to be paid for by the private sector. And of course we need improvements in the human resource, not only as a resource, but as a person who can benefit from higher productivity. So we need primary education, healthcare, improved sanitation, both in rural and urban areas. We're not going to get there without the private sector. I already mentioned that agriculture is a private sector. But I'm also talking about the post-harvest and, for that matter, the pre-farm private sector, the input suppliers, as well as the processing, the transportation, etc. But for the private sector to operate, there is a need for certain investment by the public sector. We need to make the investment so that the private sector can actually operate. They need the incentives to operate, to invest in agriculture and in the supply chain. You cannot ask a private sector to make those investments if they can't make money doing so. And in order to make money, the kind of infrastructure I just mentioned has to be in place, and much of that is what economists call public goods. That will only happen if the public sector invests in it, because the public sector captures the benefits. A private sector may not be able to capture the benefit of some of the investments I just made. We need savings and credit institutions for farmers and traders. They don't have to be public, but the public sector has to make it happen, has to serve to instigate these things. We need risk management tools for farmers and traders, particularly at a time when the extreme weather events, caused presumably by the climate change, is causing tremendous fluctuations in production and therefore in food prices. And I'm going to come back and talk about that a little later, but risk management is becoming an increasingly important aspect, and the governments have to help putting this in place. In other words, we need public goods investments, including, of course, that part of the total research that the private sector cannot capture the benefit from, but society can capture benefits. That's the public goods type research that we have talked about already. But even if it's a private goods research output, the public sector is not going to make the investment unless there is a buyer at the other end, unless there is a market, a demand for that technology or that knowledge. Therefore, it is important that the purchasing power of smallholders be strengthened. That can be done by means of credit programs, for example. It can be done by means of setting up a competitive fund, which the private sector, for that matter, the public sector as well, can compete for, with a clear specification of the technology and the knowledge needed. Once that has been produced, the fund goes to the particular research entity. That has been done in the health sector. As far as I know, it has not been done in the agricultural sector. There's been a lot of talk about it, but as far as I know, it hasn't been done. But the key point here is that if we want the private sector to produce the kind of technology and input that small, poor farmers need, we need to make sure that there is a market for that, and that means helping smallholder farmers have the ability to capture that technology, to buy that technology from the private sector. Alternatively, the public sector can produce those kinds of technologies. And so the point, again, just to repeat myself, is we need to assure incentives for the private sector to innovate for things that smallholder farmers can benefit from. Let me move now to the third policy priority. Governments should work on removing international trade distortions. We just completed a study in 14 we meaning Cornell University, just completed a study of 14 developing countries, working with researchers from these countries to try to understand how governments responded to the food price fluctuations beginning in 2007 and why they responded the way they did. One of the key issues is that almost every government will protect its own people, even if it is at the expense of the rest of the world. No matter how many international agreements a particular country government has signed, when it comes to a choice between protecting your own people, even if it's at the expense of others, that is usually what happens. Export restrictions, for example, pushed up food prices dramatically during 2007, 2008. And the reason that some countries put export restrictions on was to make sure that their domestic prices didn't go up. We need to get a handle on that. And some of you are thinking World Trade Organization. No. There is really no binding constraint to be a member of the World Trade Organization and not do those kinds of things. So there are a number of things like that we need to do. For a long time, many of us have been arguing that we should get rid of the agricultural subsidies in the European Union and the United States and Japan and Korea because they were distorting trade. But we have a whole new set of issues now that need to be dealt with. Regulation of land grabbing. I call it grabbing, others call it acquisition, and Derek Byerly is with us. He's done a lot of work on this. I'm not sure, Derek, what you call it. But what I'm getting at here is that foreign corporations, investment funds, governments will enter into developing countries and get control over large extensions of land, either by buying or by renting for, say, 99 years. They push out the small farmers who happen to be there, and then they produce, presumably, we hope, a lot of food. Now, that raises a very important issue. What is really our goal here? Is it to increase the global pile of food, or is it to improve food security for people? If it's the former, then maybe land grabbing is a good thing. They can probably produce more than the small farmers did. If it's improving food security, it's probably a bad thing, because the people that are pushed off their land, in most cases, do not seem to get alternative employment, and they become more food insecure. I could talk about this for hours, because it borders on an emotional thing for me. So before I get too emotional, let me move to the next one. Clarity on water and land tenure, very, very important. We talked a bit about that this morning. Who actually controls these resources? That's very important if we are to push ahead to meet the food security goals. Nobody knows how much food is being wasted or lost. The number that's kicked around is that roughly 1/3 of what's being produced is lost. Now, just for clarification, for the vegetarians, whatever is fed to animals is not considered a loss. I'm talking about what's produced and not consumed either by humans or by animals. Is it 1/3? We don't know. I've done a fair bit of checking, but I'm a lousy detective. The only thing I could find was that somebody some years ago put in a piece of paper, we don't really know, but we think it's roughly 1/3. And everybody's quoting that. So the fact is, we don't know. But we know it's a lot. Now, here's something that I get in a lot of trouble for. I think if we are to have sustainable food production, we need to make the producers and presumably subsequently the consumers pay for the damage that we do to natural resources. We need to provide the incentive to farmers and others to pursue sustainable production methods. And one way to do that is to say, if you are drawing down the groundwater level, you're going to pay for it. If you are polluting the river, you're going to pay for it. If you are mining the soil, you're going to pay for it. If you are emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, you're going to pay for it. That's an idea that has been kicked around for a long time. It's very difficult to implement, both in terms of actually getting it done and also to get political support for it. But if we don't put in place incentives for seeking sustainability in production and marketing, we can keep talking about sustainability, but it's never going to happen. And I'm not talking about organic production methods as the only way. That is one way, but there are many other ways of achieving sustainable production. So let's make sure we don't confuse those terms. And I know people, friends of mine, who would like us to believe that the only way we can get sustainable food systems is by producing it using the definitions of organic farming that have been agreed upon in the United States and the European Union. I disagree. So, can we achieve all of these goals? Economists like to kick around the term of trade-off. You want to get a little bit of this, a little bit more of this, you have to give up a little bit of that. That's a wonderful concept. I'm an economist. I certainly buy into it. However, there are multiple wins in this business. You don't have to give up productivity increases in order to protect the environment. There are ways of getting both of these goals. You don't have to give up the pile of food in order to improve food security. There are ways of achieving many of these goals at the same time. Now, let me finish, Tom, by talking about the policymakers' temptation. I mentioned this study of 14 developing countries before. One of the other things we found was that virtually every government, when the food prices began to increase, almost every government tried to put a brake on food price increases. But why? That was good for agriculture. Higher prices, farmers make more money. Yeah, but most governments didn't care. Why? Because farmers don't take to the streets and turn over cars and smash windows and whatever else they do. The lower income, the lower middle income in urban areas are much more likely to be a threat to government. So government tried to keep the prices low when they were otherwise going up. When they tried to do that simply by putting a price ceiling on, of course, they failed. The only way you can do this is by changing the demand and supply, so in fact you get a situation where the market price is equal to the price you want to have. Most of the governments want to stabilize prices. But no, that's not really true. That's what they said. They want to make sure prices don't go up. It's perfectly fine if the prices go down. It's the same political economy issue. They're looking after the constituency in the urban area in most countries. China is an exception. As Chekun Wang will confirm, I'm sure. He knows much more about this than I do. In China, they are very carefully looking after the impact on the rural as well as the urban population. So price stability was really more a matter of making sure prices didn't go up. Now, in the news media and elsewhere, we heard about these tremendous price fluctuations in the world market, beginning in the middle of 2007, and they run until the middle of 2008, then prices dropped, and then they came back up, and so on. That had never happened before. Everybody was surprised. Until we looked in developing countries. Guess what? They had much more severe price fluctuations, not in 07, 08, but every so often. Nothing new. The reason it hit the news media was that now suddenly it was in the international market, it was in the world market. But as we worked with the researchers from the 14 developing countries, and for that matter, research from other countries, we found, and I think I pushed a little too soon, we found that if you look to the right, you see the fluctuations in 2003, 2006. Before the international fluctuations occurred, they were larger than the fluctuations during the period we thought we had large fluctuations. So while you had large fluctuation in the world market, there was nothing new in developing countries. We really need to understand how people in the countries that we are concerned about, how they are affected, and not just how the Chicago futures market behaves. That was kind of an eye-opener for us. We didn't realize it was that clear. The research I was showing there is actually from IFPRI research rather than from the 14 countries, but we found very similar things. Countries want to put in place social safety nets, and that's absolutely wonderful as long as it's targeted on the vulnerable population. So when food prices go up, you want to put a social safety net under the people who are at high risk. Unfortunately, most of the countries targeted their safety nets and subsidies to the middle-income urban population, while the rural population was the most vulnerable. Why? Same explanation. Governments were much more worried about political stability than they were about helping poor people get over food price increases. Then there is the whole question of eco-economy. There is an increasing pressure for resources that are currently used for food to be used for other things. Biofuel, of course, cotton, we are familiar with, but there are many other uses of these resources now in what's called the eco-economy. Let me just show you finally what the implications can be if governments are so tempted by price policy that they end up in disaster. This is the Thai government's the result of the Thai government of increasing rice prices to Thai farmers above the world market price, about the market price. And Thailand is a major producer, a major exporter of rice. The government had to buy the rice at a higher price. The government now has in stock, at last count, the equivalent of 1/2 of 1 year of rice trade. Now, if they release that stock, it doesn't take Economics 101 to figure out what happens to rice prices. So that's sitting in Thailand. It is sitting nicely in straw. It's not so in India. In India, the grain stock went up dramatically, as you can see, beginning in 05, 06. It went up during the so-called food crisis, and it's now up to about 80 million tons of grain in stock. As far as I know, less than half of it is under roof. The rest looks like this. This is a similar situation in Zambia, where the government increased the price of maize, with the result that the farmers responded by doubling maize production over a period of 3 to 4 years. The government had to buy it up because the prices were higher than what the consumers could afford to pay for it. Here it is, and if you don't think this is degraded, take a closer look. This is terrible. But those are the kinds of things that can happen when you mess with the prices. Here's what actually happened in terms of production. It went from 1.4 to 2.8 million tons over a period of about 4 to 5 years. So, what's my bottom line here? Well, first of all, price policy has to be dealt with very carefully if the government wants to mess with it, for at least 2 reasons. One, if you set the prices higher than what the market will bear, there won't be consumers to buy it. And the government has to buy it up, and that's what happened. And the second issue is that those who have access to good infrastructure, those are the farmers who are going to benefit. Those who do not will not benefit from these higher prices because they can't respond. That is very much what happened in some countries with the Green Revolution. It really benefited farmers that had good infrastructure, but those who didn't could not capture benefits. In fact, they lost because the prices dropped. So that's my final comment. Let's invest more in infrastructure so that we can generate unit cost reductions through research and help farmers get access to the markets for input and output. That, to me, is the combination of research and policy. Thank you, Tom, for your patience.